And the answer would be E, a fusiform muscle would be the correct answer. The motions permitted at a synovial joint are determined by the shapes of the bone articular ends meeting at the joint and by the capsule and ligaments restricting unwanted motions at the joint. Muscles produce motion at synovial joints through contraction, which changes the position of the bones relative to the joints. Here are two examples from the previous module. So this is the shoulder joint, a ball and socket joint. Flexion occurs when the angle between the bones meeting at the joint becomes more acute, and extension occurs when the angle between the bones meeting at the joint becomes more obtuse. Abduction occurs when a limb or limb segment moves farther from the midline. Adduction occurs when a limb or limb segment moves closer to the midline. This is flexion at the elbow joint, and again, the bones are coming closer together in flexion and moving farther apart in extension. Application of a logical rule is always better than memorization of details that don't always make sense and in many cases aren't entirely true. So this is the rule that we'll use. The motion produced by a contracting muscle at a particular joint is determined by the motions permitted at the joint and the position of the muscle relative to the joint. And we'll have a variety of illustrations to illustrate what that means. So we'll start with a hypothetical muscle and a trick question. And the trick question is, contraction of this muscle will produce which motion at the shoulder joint? And the answer is none. So because the hypothetical muscle doesn't cross the shoulder joint or any other joint, contraction cannot produce motion. So it can contract all it wants, but nothing will happen. Here's an opportunity for you to apply this rule and infer from the position of the muscle and your knowledge of the motions possible at the shoulder joint, infer from the position of this hypothetical muscle what motion it can produce at the shoulder joint when it contracts. And the answer is flexion. So this muscle is positioned pretty much as the arrow is positioned in the diagram of flexion. When this muscle contracts, it will pull on the humerus and draw it closer and decrease the angle between the bones. Here's another hypothetical muscle and another real question. Contraction of this muscle will produce what motion at the shoulder joint? So again, you know that in this plane, the motions possible at the ball and socket joint, which is the shoulder, are flexion and extension. And this hypothetical muscle is positioned behind the joint. When it contracts, the motion produced will be extension. Another hypothetical muscle and another real question. Contraction of this muscle will produce what motion at the shoulder joint? Contraction of the hypothetical muscle will produce abduction at the shoulder joint. And again, the hypothetical muscle, when it contracts, what will be the motion produced at the shoulder joint? And the answer is adduction. So instead of learning a long list of muscle attachments and muscle functions, it's much easier to take what you know about the motions possible at a joint and what you know about the position of the motion relative to the joint and infer what it does when it contracts rather than having to memorize a long list. So now for your quiz, we'll take some real muscles and without having to memorize a long list of attachments and functions, just by the position relative to the joint, you'll be able to infer the action produced at the joint when it contracts. This is the brachialis muscle. When it contracts, it will produce which of the following motions?